The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry plains. Jack, a rugged cowboy, sat in his small wooden cabin, sipping from a chipped mug of coffee. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to the quiet solitude that the Wild West offered. The only sound in the cabin was the occasional creak of the wood as the wind blew against it. Jack had always liked it this way, peaceful, uninterrupted. For years, Jack had been content with the simple life of a cowboy. He had no need for distractions like relationships or family. He preferred working the land, tending to his cattle, and keeping to himself. The idea of love seemed distant, something that belonged in someone else's world. He had seen enough heartbreak in his life to know that it was better to keep his heart guarded. But that evening, as Jack prepared to settle in for the night, his peaceful existence was about to come to an abrupt end. The door to the cabin suddenly crashed open with a force that shook the walls. Jack's hand instinctively reached for his revolver, but he stopped himself just in time. He didn't know what to expect, but he had learned to be cautious in this part of the world. As the dust settled, a woman stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with urgency. She was young, with long dark hair tangled from the ride, and her skin was covered in the dirt of the plains. Without a word, she strode into the cabin, her boots echoing against the wooden floor. Jack was taken aback, not just by her sudden appearance but by the wildness in her eyes. She didn't look like someone who would be lost or confused. No, there was a fierceness to her, a determination that was impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the cabin as though searching for something. Then she turned back to Jack, her gaze sharp. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "And it's not negotiable." Jack's brow furrowed. The woman didn't look like anyone he had ever met. His first instinct was to tell her to leave, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't there to cause trouble. She looked like someone who had been through more than most people could handle, and her eyes held a story he couldn't ignore. "Talk to me? About what?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice even. The woman took a deep breath as though gathering her thoughts. For a moment there was silence between them, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken tension. Finally she spoke again, her words coming out in a rush. "Marry me or die." Jack stared at her, stunned by the suddenness of her words. He had heard plenty of crazy things in his time, but this was different. He couldn't tell if she was serious or if it was some kind of joke. His mind raced, trying to process what she had just said. "Marry you?" Jack repeated, still in disbelief. "You break down my door and then you expect me to marry you?" The woman's eyes flashed with frustration. "I didn't come here to ask. I came to tell you. If you don't marry me, they'll kill me, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way." Jack wasn't sure whether to laugh or take her seriously, but there was something about her tone, something raw and desperate, that made him hesitate. She wasn't acting like someone who was playing games. She was terrified. "Who's going to kill you?" Jack asked, his voice softening. The woman's face hardened and she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice as if someone might be listening. "I'm Apache, and my people are being hunted down. If I don't marry you, they'll find me. They'll use me to get to my people, and then it'll all be over." Jack was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had heard stories about the tensions between settlers and Native American tribes, but he hadn't realized it had gotten so bad. He wasn't a man who typically got involved in other people's troubles, especially not when it meant risking his own life. But something about this woman, something about the fear in her eyes, made him reconsider. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep his distance from the world's troubles, but now, standing before this stranger, he wasn't so sure. Was he really willing to turn his back on someone who needed help? He glanced at the door, wondering if she had brought danger with her. But before he could make up his mind, the woman spoke again, her voice more desperate now. "I don't have a choice, cowboy," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "I've come all this way because you're my only hope." "You're the only one who can save me." Jack was taken aback by the intensity of her plea. He had never been one to rush into things, especially not when the stakes were this high, but something in his gut told him that this woman wasn't lying. She was desperate, and in a world as unforgiving as this, people didn't lie when their lives were on the line. Still, Jack wasn't ready to give up everything for someone he barely knew. "Why me?" he asked. There must be someone else who can help you. The woman shook her head, her expression hardened. There's no one else. I've tried. They're closing in on us. You're my only chance. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility settle over him. She was right. He was the only one who could help her. But the decision weighed heavily on him. He wasn't just making a choice for himself anymore. His actions would determine the fate of this woman and possibly many others. I don't know what you expect me to do, Jack muttered, his hand instinctively tightening around the coffee mug. I'm just a cowboy. I don't have any power to fight against what's coming for you. The woman stepped even closer, her eyes locking onto his. You may not have power, but you have the one thing they don't expect, a will to fight. And that's what I need. So I'm asking you one last time, cowboy. Marry me or die. Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of her desperation. Jack felt the weight of the decision settle in his chest. He had never imagined his life would be changed by someone like her, a stranger, a woman of a different tribe, with a plea that felt like life or death. But here he was, caught in a storm he hadn't seen coming. As the woman turned and walked toward the door, Jack realized something. This wasn't just about her. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be. Could he turn his back and live with the consequences, or would he stand up and do what he knew was right? His mind raced, but his heart had already made up its mind. The following morning, Jack sat in his cabin, staring out the window at the rising sun. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of the woman who had come into his life so suddenly. Her words echoed in his mind. Marry me or die. He had never expected to be in a situation like this, and the weight of it all hung heavily on his chest. Jack wasn't the kind of man who easily rushed into decisions. He preferred to take his time, weigh his options, and think things through. But there was something about her, something raw and desperate in her eyes that made him reconsider his usual way of living. The fear in her voice had been real, and deep down Jack knew she wasn't lying. Her people were in danger, and the world around her was closing in. As he sat there trying to make sense of everything, Jack couldn't help but think of the choice he had ahead of him. He could stay in the comfort of his quiet, solitary life and turn his back on her, or he could take a risk, one that could change everything. He wasn't sure he was ready for such a big decision, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was at stake. The cabin door creaked open, and Jack looked up to see the woman standing in the doorway again. This time she didn't burst in with the same urgency as before. Instead, she stood there, her posture tense, as though she, too, was uncertain about what would come next. I didn't expect you to come back, Jack said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. She didn't respond at first. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his in the dim light of the morning. Jack had seen many types of people in his life, settlers, ranchers, outlaws, but this woman, this Apache girl, was different. She wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered before. She had a strength to her that was undeniable, but there was also a vulnerability that made her seem human. She wasn't just a person to be saved. She was someone who was capable of saving herself if given the chance. I couldn't leave, she finally spoke, her voice quieter now, as though the fight had left her. You don't know what it's like. Being hunted like an animal, not knowing if today's the day you'll be caught. I have nowhere else to go. Jack felt the weight of her words hit him. It was easy for him to forget how dangerous life could be outside his little world in the cabin. He had always kept to himself, avoided trouble, and stayed out of the conflicts that seemed to swirl around everyone else. But now this woman had brought that danger to his doorstep, and whether he liked it or not, he was part of the fight. He stood up slowly and walked over to her, unsure of what to say or how to react. The last thing he wanted was to make promises he couldn't keep, but something in him told him that he couldn't turn away from her now. She had already made her plea, and in a way, Jack had already made his decision. So, what do you want from me? Jack asked, his voice steady. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had to know exactly what he was getting into. She looked up at him, her face serious. I don't want much, just your protection. If you marry me, we can escape this life. We can leave the danger behind and start somewhere new. Jack felt the weight of her request settle on his shoulders. Marrying her wasn't something he had ever considered, and he wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected, a quiet hope. She wasn't asking for love. She was asking for survival. He let out a long breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I'm not sure I can offer you everything you're asking for. This life I've built, it's mine. And it's not easy to just change everything." The woman's eyes softened, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was a quiet understanding. "I don't expect you to change your life for me. I just need you to stand by me to help me survive. You don't have to love me. You just need to help me stay alive." Jack's heart tightened as he looked at her. She wasn't asking for anything grand, no promises of love or affection. She was asking for something simpler, something more difficult, a chance. "A chance to survive, I'll help you," Jack finally said, his voice steady. "But I'm not making any promises beyond that. This isn't going to be easy, and we're both going to have to fight for what we want." The woman nodded, a small but grateful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That's all I need." Jack turned away for a moment, his mind still racing. He wasn't the kind of man to make hasty decisions, but he knew this was different. He had never been faced with a situation like this before. His life, once so simple and predictable, was now tangled up in something far bigger than him. But as he thought about it, Jack realized that he didn't have to face it alone. He had a chance to make a difference, to be a part of something that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were filled with difficult decisions. Jack and the woman, whose name was Ayla, began to make plans. They had to move quickly. The danger that Ayla faced was real, and it wasn't long before Jack realized just how serious things had become. It wasn't just a matter of surviving. It was about staying one step ahead of the people who would do anything to capture her. As they made their way across the plains, Jack couldn't help but think about the future. The life he had known was slipping away, and a new one was beginning to take shape. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. Ayla was no longer just a stranger. She had become someone important to him, someone he couldn't imagine turning his back on. They had a long road ahead of them, and Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. But as they moved forward, he realized that in a way they were both starting anew. They were no longer just survivors. They were fighters determined to carve out a place for themselves in a world that didn't make room for the weak. And with that thought, Jack's resolve grew stronger. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to face it.